Hey guys, it's Sean McGeever, and I'm here doing a Talk Tuesday once again on a Wednesday. Tuesdays are really busy, but I'm going to stick with the Tuesday theme. And what I do is try to give some ideas on how you might go through one of the chapters of Luke to explain what the gospel is. And so this week we are looking at Luke 11 in my Young Life Club. So I'm going to give you some ideas. I'd encourage you to dig into it yourself and come up with your own thoughts and ideas, but maybe something that I'll say here will spark an idea or two. So when you look at Luke 11, what you'll find is that there probably are not many stories or accounts of that you've heard in many Young Life or Wildlife talks. They're not going to be ones that you normally hear at camp or whatever, but I actually think that that's a wonderful challenge so that we can continually let Scripture help us form what the gospel is. Kind of basically like what my gospel is or what I'm kind of used to the gospel. And so I actually think just this digging in deep to say, what is it about Jesus? What do we learn about the gospel in this chapter that I need to learn and help shape how we talk about the gospel? So anyway, this is one of those chapters. And when you look at this chapter, you'll see a couple categories of things talked about. You'll see the first section is about prayer. The second section is about demons, and there's another section about those who seek a sign as a way to seek God, which is maybe a convicting one. I know I always pray for that shooting star. Not a bad thing, but that's not always the way that God wants to be sought. So you can read about that starting in verse 29 if you want. None will be given to you except for the sign of Jonah, which is the resurrection. Then there's a little transition part, but really the last part that I think is the part that I think it might be most useful. And I call this, what did I write down? I called it in the little sheet here. A large section could be summed up as, what does your inner and outer life look like? So I think this idea of examining what we kind of like, how we present ourselves and the way that we look and our kind of exterior versus what's really going on in our inside life. I think a lot of people identify with that, and that's an important kind of angle to talk about the gospel. Jesus does, so we can too. So in this section, I actually want to talk about the part where Jesus confronts the Pharisees, which is verses 39 through 42. And I found an outline from Darrell Bach, who's a New Testament scholar, that I thought was really helpful. He said that Jesus has a fourfold rebuke of the Pharisees. Number one, he calls it outside clean, inside not. That's where actually I'm going to focus most of my effort. Then he gives three woes. Woe, neglecting God's justice and love. Woe, loving the best seats. And woe, leading people to death. I mean, pretty intense. So Jesus' words for the Pharisees here are pretty intense. So in this section, basically Jesus had asked the Pharisees to dine with him, and he doesn't wash his hands, and it kind of goes on, and Jesus has some pretty blunt words for him. When you read it, I think hopefully dig into it, but I found a couple things that might be a good main point there. One is, we say this in Young Life, and a lot of it depends what you mean by it, but I think it's really powerful, which is that you belong before you believe. So a lot of times what people think about when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to Christianity, is that you got to look the part. You got to act like a Christian. You got to maybe dress like a Christian. You got to use Christian-y words, and that you actually belong to us and to Young Life and to God. And, like, you belong. Everyone belongs before you believe or even before you behave. And so if you think you got to get your outside act together in order to be a part of this or to be at club tonight, that is not the case. So anyway, just the idea that the inside will change the outside. In Young Life, the outside, sure, maybe we might want to avoid really terrible things or something like that. But in Young Life, what we want to talk about is that inside of our life, from inside out. We don't want you to just conform. We want you to experience what we've experienced, which is God changing us from the inside out. So that'd be one main point, maybe just that you belong before you believe. Then another one is that nothing on your outside makes you an outsider to God. I guess it's just another way to saying the same thing. He sees your inside, and that we're all the same. We all need Jesus. Doesn't matter if you look like you're put together or if you're really rough around the edges. We all need Jesus. So there's that. What does this passage show us about Jesus spent time with all sorts of people. And a lot of times we kind of talk about how Jesus spent time with the needy, and certainly he does. But he also spent time with the religious people, those who actually didn't seem like they had a lot of kind of challenges, or they looked really put together. And Jesus actually spent time with everyone. He wasn't all that concerned about the exterior, what people looked like or how they acted. He knew that everyone on the inside needed God's power and God's work in their life. Another theme that this shows us, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, which is that Jesus didn't follow man-made rules. He didn't follow kind of human rules. And I'll talk more about this, about the hand washing. So he was about certainly honoring and following God. But when people try to make things up that weren't quite what God had to say, he wasn't too concerned with conforming to those standards. Another one was that Jesus was comfortable calling out hypocrisy. Now, on this one, we got to be careful because we are not Jesus. I need to be very careful to judge. You can read in Matthew, is it 7 in the Sermon on the Mount about judging. But we should know when we say, what does this show us about Jesus? Jesus was not afraid to call out things that were wrong. One last thing, though there's a lot of things, is that Jesus is very concerned with love and justice. And I have a couple scriptures in the little handout, whether it's Micah 6:8 or otherwise. God is really concerned with love and justice. You can camp out there and say, God really wants justice in the world, and he wants you to know what that's like. He wants love to be made known in this world. He wants you to experience his love. And I'll touch on that in regard to what he talked about, like with tithing and stuff, which is a technical detail. Probably I'll try to help explain that. But anyway, what does this have to do with our life? Well, Jesus calls us to examine our interior life, which might be things like our heart or our mind or our passions or the things that we love, the things that probably no one really sees. It's kind of the gears that turn inside of us that then work outward. As primary. So the primary thing that Jesus is looking at is our interior, who we are on the inside. And exterior things are a distant second, or almost just a consequence of the things that are on our inside. So what does this have to do with our life? I'd say we all need to look on the inside, and you know what? Only you know your inside. Only you really know what's going on the inside of your life. As much as you might look together or not put together on the outside, only God knows your heart, and you do too. And really, no one else does. And so just kind of challenging people to think about that. Now, a couple technical details, and this will really help with this section. First off, the Pharisees, I know maybe in Young Life or something we might read quickly past that, but remember, when we do a Young Life talk, a Wildlife talk, we want to make sure that we explain any word that if someone had never heard the Bible before, that we can explain what that is. So a Pharisee was a religious leader in Jesus' day, and they had actually codified or made a list of all of the Old Testament laws. I think there's 613 of them. And what they did was, in one way, it really wasn't bad. They wanted to say, we think that these laws are so important that we want to really make sure that we're abiding by them. And so they had the 613 laws, but then they added a whole bunch of clarifications. Well, this is what that means, practically speaking, when people would come and have questions about how does this actually apply. So they had enormous writings on exactly how to carry everything out. So that's who the Pharisees were. They were concerned with the laws, but not only the laws, but like the very specific practical application of them. And it really kind of made those into God's laws as well. So they were really about obeying them, and they were also really about trying to enforce those upon others. And then in verse 38, when it says, what does it say here? It says that the Pharisees were astonished to see that Jesus did not first wash before dinner. And this becomes an issue here. What is this washing before dinner? Why are they talking about this? And this is important to get, which is there was no Old Testament rule or law about requiring people to wash their hands before they ate. So that's really important. Now, it's not that the Old Testament didn't talk about that, and I have some scriptures listed on the little sheet that I hand out from Genesis and Judges, where like people did tend to do that, And then there's some other verses in Leviticus that talk a lot about objects which are clean and unclean. So you kind of have like a cultural thing where people tended to wash their hands, and you do have a law about that there are things that are clean and unclean. But what the Pharisees had done was that they had made a requirement of bringing those together. They really had kind of taken two loose ends, which weren't specific about this particular application, and they had made it into a law and an expectation for everyone. And so really this had become a man-made rule, a human rule. This was not an Old Testament law that Jesus was breaking, but they made it seem like it. They were really concerned with the outside rather than the things that Jesus is going to talk about. So I hope I explained that all right there. In verse 41, it starts talking about alms. So, but give as alms those things that are within. An alm is just basically like an offering. It's like offering something up. Now, specifically in the Old Testament, an alm would have been like giving money or food to the poor. It would have just been an offering. So when it's talking in verse 41, but give alms as alms those things that are within, it's basically like offer your inside as your offering to God and to the world. So like kind of prioritize, not just the like, oh, I could give you this food. Here it is. That's an exterior thing. It's good. But if you could offer your inside, that would be primary. Another thing, and it's in the very next verse, and this is the part I was talking about, them tithing, mint and all that. It says, what are you, Pharisees? For you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect justice and love of God. So what's this whole tithing thing? Well, in the Old Testament, the word tithe really means like tenth. The words even sound similar. And it would have just come down to the Old Testament law and principle that you needed to give 10% of everything. And they were agrarian societies. Mostly this came down to when you had your crops and things like that, you would give 10% and set it aside for God. And so he's calling out really specifically of like agriculture or produce or what have you, mint and rue and every herb. So what he's saying here is you guys are so diligent to try to follow this 10% rule with everything, including like, think of like a piece of mint, which is like a leaf, like a really tiny leaf. Then going, okay, I need to give you 10% of this tiny leaf. They were paying attention to like these precise details of the smallest little bit, but they missed the massively important reason why any of that existed, which is about justice and about love. I mean, actually, I could go into it, but one of the things was they weren't allowed to go back through the field for a second time because they needed to be able to provide for the poor and those that were without and foreigners and all that. And Jesus is saying, you guys don't get it. You guys pay microscopic attention to the smallest little part of a leaf, but you don't understand anything about love or justice. So you really just kind of see him missing the point there. They're paying such attention to exterior things and missing enormous heart things, enormous internal things. So that part there is maybe a bit cryptic, what tithing, mint, but that's kind of why it's so important. Okay, I got a couple illustrations and then I'm going to wrap it up. But Jesus talks about washing hands, and then he talks about washing the outside of something. So I think you could wash your hands if halfway through the talk, or maybe at the end, you really wanted to drive home your point. You say, here's something that we do hopefully every day. We wash our hands. It maybe kind of make your hands a little dirty. I mean, not muddy, but maybe just maybe a little bit normally dirty. And then you could get a clear bowl with some water in it. I think it'd be good if it was clear because they're going to see the water get dirtier and dirtier. Get some soap, maybe get a little scrub brush and really get in there, get the nails, really say, if I was to really wash my hands, and then you are using this and getting it in the bowl, I think it would just draw attention to the idea of an exterior cleaning, which we all know about. We take showers, wash our hands, all that. But what about on the inside? Maybe God really it's nice to have the outside looking okay, but what about your inside? What about your heart? What about your life? What about your passions? What about your response to Jesus inside of your heart and your mind and your whole self? So you could go there. Another one could be, and this one's a little more extreme, but you could bring in a trash can, maybe just a little trash can from the kitchen, say if you're having club at someone's house. But if you really wanted to go crazy extreme and get everyone's attention, the problem would be it would smell. But you could roll in, like in our neighborhood, we have big trash cans that are on the street that the dump truck comes and gets. You could roll that thing in there, and then you start, like, washing on the outside of it and saying, man, I'm just going to make this thing so clean. It's going to be so great. Like, I'm going to polish this. It's going to look awesome. And then you go, but there's a problem. And you just open up the lid and you say it's full of all sorts of garbage is what it is. And say, it'd be pointless. No garbage men would go around and say, oh, you know what we're going to do today is we're going to polish every single garbage can. No, what we do is we empty it. And we start there. And what God wants to do is he wants to look inside of our lives, and he wants to change us and purify us from the inside out. That's where you start. And so I think you could then maybe connect the dots either at the beginning of your club talk or at the end of the club talk and talk about how Jesus has done that in your life as you follow God, that you're kind of a work in progress on the outside. You're trying to figure out maybe how to live with more love, with more justice, more like Christ. But really that work has to start on the inside. And you can invite them to say, I don't know where you're at. Maybe you're a mess. Maybe you're kind of put together. But all of us could ask God tonight, do you want to enter inside of my life? Maybe for the first time, maybe for the millionth time, and say yes to Jesus. So anyway, there's some ideas. I hope you can find something helpful in there and improve upon it and pray over it and have it just be an awesome talk. But hopefully something in there helps, and I hope you have a great week. All right, talk to you later.